the highest number of daily cases yet.
To 8 p.m. last night, we had 1,542 cases of community transmission.
Hospitals overwhelmed and more people dying.
Sadly, we report today the deaths of 9 people who had COVID-19.
Despite that, Gladys Berejiklian is pulling the pin.
I don't know how this will be received, but the 11 a.m. information will be done by health staff through video link. Sunday will be the last day we officially do the press conferences in this way.
Her reason?
To expect the Leader of the Government indefinitely to do this every day means that I'm not doing my job properly. Please don't shout. I can hear everybody.
We're going to see hospitals come under the greatest stress they've ever seen. And you and your ministers are about to disappear off camera and cancel this press conference. Are you going into hiding?
Can I just say very, very clearly and loudly to the people of New South Wales, we will be here whenever we need to communicate something very importantly to the community.
We're getting a video message.
What we also need to do is all of us have to start accepting that we need to live with COVID.
Shouldn't you hold these press conferences until after the peak?
How do people have confidence that scrutiny of government is taking place?
And I'll turn up when I need to.
Appalling decision by the New South Wales Premier. Worst of the crisis is about to hit.
Hiding while your citizens die. In a democracy, political leaders are accountable to the public. Front up. That's the job. Life with COVID doesn't mean your government chooses when it gets scrutinised.
I had some of you complaining that every day was too frequent.
The state's cases aren't expected to peak until next week, and the roadmap to COVID normal has only just been unveiled. So is Gladys bailing a bit early?
I'll turn up when I need to.
I'd like to know who some of those journalists are. Professor Bill Botel is a strategic health policy consultant with the University of New South Wales, and he joins us now. So, Professor, here we are in the middle of the worst health crisis New South Wales has ever seen, with more bad news to come. Is this a good strategy by the New South Wales Premier?
Well, not just a health crisis, but an economic and social one. It is certainly the worst crisis in the modern history of New South Wales, and it was caused by the decision of the New South Wales government to open up to COVID Delta in a largely unvaccinated state in the middle of June. And the consequences of that have worked out over 3 months and are going to get worse in the next couple of months. So this is an extraordinary decision to walk away from the consequences of the crisis that the decisions of the New South Wales government have brought down on the New South Wales people.
So what do you think the Premier's reasoning is here?
Well, you'd have to ask the Premier in one way, but it seems clear that the Premier is over it. She's over COVID. She's not bothered anymore by what is coming down the track. And that, unfortunately, will be an increase in the number of cases. That will be peaking at about 3,400 cases a day in October. That's over 20,000 cases a week. And we know that about 10 or 11% of those cases will end up in hospital, and many of those will end up in ICU. And at that level, in October, the ICU capacity in Sydney, as we would know it, is exhausted, and they move to what they call code black, which is you don't want to be there, basically. Now, this is in the middle of a crisis of the making of the New South Wales government and the Premier. And transparency builds trust, turning up builds trust, but nothing trashes trust more than refusing to turn up and be accountable to the people through the press and, of course, to the Parliament, elected by the people. This doesn't seem to be any longer convenient to the Premier of New South Wales.
Code Black certainly sounds ominous. In practical terms, what does that mean?
Well, of course, it means that more people will die, more people will be on ventilators in ICU. We've seen yesterday with the so-called roadmap for the fully vaccinated, part and parcel of this so-called living with COVID are restrictions, lockdowns, the threat of further measures going into the indefinite future. This is the consequence of a plan that ended up where we are today. The New South Wales government decided to let cases soar before they started vaccinating. And now we're trapped in this limbo. We can't seem to go forward. We can't seem to go back to the days of zero COVID.
And all we have to look forward to. You seem to be insinuating, though, that New South Wales government has done this deliberately. I don't think anyone's seriously suggesting that, are they?
Well, these were the consequences of a plan that was assembled in secret. None of this was put to the people or the parliament before it happened. Nobody knew this was
But what plan are you talking about? Are you seriously saying this was a deliberate plan by the Premier to let this get out of control?
No, I'm not saying it's a deliberate plan, but I'm saying it is the consequences, maybe the unintended consequence of what's happened. The lockdowns are the consequence of the decision to let COVID run in New South Wales before the population was remotely fully vaccinated or even partially vaccinated. Now, in those circumstances, the architect of the policy should front up to the press and to the parliament every day.
The decision to stop holding these daily press conferences, maybe there's some logic to it. Surely we can just read the case numbers online. Maybe this is just Gladys being efficient with her time so that she can spend the rest of her day actually dealing with the outbreak.
Doing what? What would be more important than hearing from the people about how the plan is going? There is no greater responsibility on the Premier in New South Wales today than to take responsibility for the consequences of the policies that she has and her government has imposed on the people of New South Wales. And the Premier's got to be accountable. You turn up. You get asked the inconvenient questions. And if you have to, hopefully, then you adjust policy in the light of what's actually happening out on the ground in New South Wales. You don't turn your back on the consequences of the policy that you've implemented.
Well, Bill, you've been absolutely straight with that message right from the very beginning of this Delta outbreak. And as always, we appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you.
OK, thank you.
With so much content online, it's sometimes hard to keep up with it all. And let's face it, who has the time? The Project YouTube has you covered with the stories that matter. Hit subscribe for a daily list of the news that you need to know.